So all over the news, we are seeing articles left and right about Twitter's present feud with President Donald Trump as tensions across the entirety of the United States continue to rise as more and more people are frustrated by, shall I say, the management, not the leadership of the nation. Today, I want to focus on Twitter. Fred, you have a new book coming out titled Words on Fire: The Power of Incendiary Language and How to Confront It. You knew incendiary language was important when you originally came up with the idea, but recent events have shown it is more important now than ever. So talk to me a little bit about your book and why the topic is important.
I began working on the book in the aftermath of the Tree of Life shooting, when I saw the relationship between language then President Donald Trump had been using in the midterm election campaign for Congress, and how it had been adopted by people with ideologies that were already divisive, but he took them to the next level. So he essentially empowered latent white supremacists to become active committers of mass violence. And I began writing the book by documenting 12 forms of language that have historically preceded mass violence incidents up to and including genocides. And I documented those forms of language, and I showed that Donald Trump as candidate and president uses all 12. Whether he does it on Twitter, or he does it in interviews, or he does it at rallies, I've seen another pattern. And that is, when he began using these forms of language, he did it provisionally. He did it conditionally. So if Obama wasn't born in the United States, then he cannot be president. As he got away with it, he escalated the intensity of it. So it became Nancy Pelosi supports human trafficking. Nothing conditional about that at all. Now, immediately after he said Nancy Pelosi supports human trafficking, another white supremacist who was doing an assassination list and was equipping himself to assassinate Trump critics put Nancy Pelosi on that list. Thankfully, he was arrested by the FBI and he's awaiting trial. He never was able to carry out his attempted assassinations. But what we're seeing this week is an even greater escalation, because except for a couple of off-the-cuff remarks and rallies where candidate Trump said, why don't we just punch that guy in the face, he hasn't actively used the language of violence. He's used the language of dehumanizing or of demonizing. But now when he says, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, that's a different category of language. I also want to note that what he said on Twitter to the governor of Minnesota was, the military is behind you. When the looting starts, the shooting starts. And it's that combination that makes that kind of language even more dangerous. Now, if you study the history of authoritarianism, you note that one of the pretexts authoritarians use is mobilizing the military under the guise of putting down civil unrest. And then what becomes a state of emergency becomes the new normal. I don't think we're there yet, but we're getting perilously close to that kind of situation.
And what is the danger of incendiary language? I mean, in the book, you talk about lone wolf attacks. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how,
Sure.
and it's not just Trump, right? It's all leaders.
All leaders have the capacity to step over the line.
And which is why this book is imperative for everybody to read, because
it's not a book about Trump. It's a book about leaders and language, and how there are certain forms of language combined with a charismatic speaker and a receptive audience that inspire or empower or provoke people to get so riled up that they want to take matters into their own hands. And in the book, I focus on the scholarship on national security and scholarship on terrorism, counterterrorism. And there's a phenomenon that has been documented that has an inaccessible name, and that name is stochastic terrorism. And the phrase stochastic terrorism was invented by a statistician in risk management who, after the 9/11 attacks, said instead of command and control terrorism, we're going to see something more like stochastic terrorism. And that is terrorism that is statistically predictable, even if you can't predict that this individual will commit this act of terror against that target. After the assassination of Dr. George Tiller, who was assassinated in the aftermath of equivalent language that I document in the book, the use of communication in ways that inspires violence took on the label of stochastic terrorism. And the scholarship on lone wolf terrorism has a whole category around stochastic terrorism, which is terrorism or violence provoked by language. I consider the phrase stochastic to be difficult for people to use or to understand, so I have come at this from a different direction. And that is, who is it who is inspired to commit acts of violence on a continuum up to terrorism? And what is it that inspires them? Well, the national security vocabulary says lone wolves are the metaphor. And so they use the phrase lone wolf terrorism for terrorism committed by a lone actor without direction from a central authority. What motivates many of those lone wolves to commit acts of violence is language, almost on the par with the kind of dog whistle we hear about in dog whistle politics. And dog whistle politics is something has a private meaning beyond the public meaning, and followers of a certain ideology tend to understand the private meaning. I take that metaphor and I call it lone wolf whistles that inspire lone wolves to commit acts of violence when it's random violence. I call it lone wolf violence. When it's organized, planned against a mass target, I call it lone wolf whistle terrorism.
Great. So now let's get on the topic of Twitter. How do Twitter's policies that flag tweets about hateful conduct, sensitive media, and their most recent civic integrity policy, how does it apply as, some of the content you talk about in your book, and what are their actions that they're taking?
Twitter has always had terms of use that had boundaries. They haven't been particularly consistent in the way they police those boundaries. But for example, overtly racist language was prohibited on Twitter, and Twitter began to shut down accounts of explicitly racist language. The Tree of Life shooter had been shut down on Twitter, but he and other white supremacists went to another site called Gab, and they were able to do all of their white supremacist rhetoric on Gab. What I found is that the president's tweets calling, for example, migrants seeking asylum and invasion was picked up on Gab, and the Tree of Life shooter actually posted about 10 days before the shooting, I see they've stopped calling them illegal aliens, they now call them invaders, I like this. And then he posted more and more agitated Gabs about invasion being funded by George Soros and a Jewish conspiracy. And then he posted the identity of a Jewish refugee resettlement agency that was financed by synagogues. And he warned the synagogues, hey, we're on to you that you are sponsoring this invasion. And then about 90 minutes before the Tree of Life shooting, he posted, I'm tired of this particular agency bringing in invaders to slaughter our people, I'm going in. And then he killed 11 people in the Tree of Life synagogue. The fact that Twitter was the president's communication vehicle of choice was due to the fact that they pretty much left him alone. Now, if you look at the authoritarian playbook, you see that authoritarians try to control communications in three different ways. The first is they discredit sources of objective information. The president does that by first labeling things fake news, and then the escalation was, and the news media are enemy of the people, and oh, by the way, when they criticize me, they commit treason. That's right out of the authoritarian playbook. The second way is they use communication channels that they either control or that are unmediated. So propaganda posters, loudspeakers in public squares or on trucks are historically the kinds of propaganda that authoritarians have used. Trump was able to use Twitter as essentially his unmediated loudspeaker. And he now objects to the mediation because he knows that he can't quite use the same level of open platform that he used to do before.
Right.
The third way that authoritarians use communication is they create their own news organizations.
There you go.
That
That's
have
what I was
the
going to talk about.
appearance of journalism, but are actually ideologically and temperamentally aligned with the leader. Now, the president didn't have to invent one because he had it in Fox News. But interestingly, in the past 6 weeks, he started to feud with Fox News. So the channel that he used that was journalism, he is now having contention with. And the channel that he used that was unmediated is now challenging him, and he doesn't have another outlet. And so part of the president's reaction, which seems like an overreaction simply to labeling something as fact-checked, is because he realizes that his unmediated channels are no longer as available to him as they used to be.
Which is why we saw an executive order get pushed out the day after he was flagged.
And it's very clear that the president doesn't have an appreciation of how the Constitution works. He certainly doesn't have an appreciation of what the First Amendment means, but the First Amendment about free speech does not guarantee consequence-free speech. The Supreme Court has put limits on the kinds of speech that are acceptable and not punishable. So, for example, you cannot use language that has the immediate impact of causing a public safety threat. So the way that the justice of the Supreme Court framed it almost 100 years ago is you don't have the right to yell fire in a crowded theater that isn't on fire, because a predictable consequence of that is panic, and that panic will cause people to be killed in the process of trying to evacuate the building. There's also limits on what is known as commercial speech. So misleading advertising is not permitted. Free speech does not mean that you can mislead. Now, the Supreme Court has said that political speech deserves the highest level of protection, but that doesn't mean that there is no consequence to political speech. And people who engage in political speech still can be held accountable for the consequences of that political speech. My book is about the consequences of language mostly political leaders, but not exclusively political leaders, use in ways that have the same effect as provoking panic in a crowded theater that isn't on fire. And that is, you can predict that people will be riled up, that people will be emotionally triggered to take things out on others. And the scholarship on lone wolf terrorism says the lone wolf takes the dehumanization that the leader creates and says, it is my place in a noble struggle to remedy this injustice. So they see themselves as warriors in a just cause. The Tree of Life shooter saw himself as that. The mail bomber specifically called himself a soldier in the war against right and wrong, between right and wrong. I'm a soldier in the war between right and wrong. And he saw himself on the right side in sending mail bombs to people the president criticized. The assassin whom I mentioned, who was arrested before he was able to carry out his plot, also saw himself as a warrior. He happened to be a member of the military. He saw himself as a warrior in this righteous struggle to protect the white homeland against the invasion of people who were different from what he thought Americans should look like. We saw the same thing in the New Zealand mosque shooter, who not only used Trump's language, but pointed to Trump as a model of white nationalism. And we saw the same thing in the El Paso shooter, who specifically said that he was protecting Texas from an invasion from Mexico. Now, that is Trump language all the way through. And my book is intended to help civic leaders, engaged citizens, journalists, and others to recognize the patterns early, to sound the alarm, to hold up this phenomenon, and to say, we can't let you get away with that.
Definitely. I think right now what we're seeing is a lot of people are, I mean, emotions range from completely angry, livid, to deflated and helpless. And people don't know what they need to do or what they can do about things like this because it's happening all around us. But it's safe to say that your book includes solutions on how to confront it and what to do. When is the book coming out?
The publication date is June 30. The book has been printed and is shipping to booksellers now. So it may be shipped by booksellers before June 30, but the formal publication date is June 30. This is my fifth book. And in all four of the other books, the book shipped weeks before the formal publication date. So if this follows the pattern, then people should start getting the books in their mailboxes. Booksellers are still not universally open, even as states begin to reopen, but Amazon, BNN.com, and other online booksellers should begin shipping in the next 2 weeks.
Great. And that's the book right behind you, isn't it?
Yes, this is actually the galley proof that was sent to journalists and reviewers. It's not the actual book itself, but this is what the book will be, absent the galley proof notice and the watermark that is intended to prevent counterfeiting. So yes, the book is in physical form now, and we will soon be able to hold it in our hands. There's also an ebook edition that's available both on Amazon as a Kindle and on iTunes as an ebook. It isn't ready yet, but there will eventually be an audio edition of the book as well.
Awesome. Fantastic. So if you are interested in more information about this book, please visit wordsonfire.net. Fred, is there anything else you want to add? I know that we will be tuning in together multiple more times to discuss the book and the topics you lay out in the book, because there are so many important things happening in the world right now. And I feel like it is a moral imperative to share the information that you talk about in this book, because we as people have to do what's right. And we need to be able to identify and recognize and know how to stop things like this from happening.
And in the book, I profile 3 leaders who went too far and what was necessary to get them to recognize that they had gone too far and to pull back and try to fix it. So I have a guide for engaged citizens and civic leaders. Here are the necessary ingredients to call attention to this and to hold the leader accountable. Simply asking the question, aren't you concerned that your words might provoke violence? And he said, no, I'm not concerned about that. And we need to do more than simply ask the question. We need to name the pattern and show that it is not only explanatory looking backwards, but predictive looking forwards.
Great. Well, thank you for your time, and tune in for our next commentary.
Thank you.